Hello, Brother Monroe here. Welcome back to Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, and I am joined today by our resident expert in all things naval, Drachinifel.
Hello.
And today we are going to be talking about the results from the Battleship League Division 1, first of all, and then also the final results overall. And I'll have them appear on screen. You don't just have to look at this Chinese battleship that's floating about. That's just to keep you entertained while we chat. So, the Division 1 results. I thought Division 1, the table maybe doesn't show it, but for those that watched the fights, they'll know that it was extremely close. So, all of the ships pretty much were able to score wins against all of the others. I think with the exception of the Treaty Fudge against Yamato. So even Vanguard and Bismarck were able to get at least one round in against all the other ships. So it was very, very close. It often came down to a tiebreaker, and the tiebreakers were often quite close. So it was a very tight division, much tighter than the others. But that's definitely worth pointing out. So just from having a look, what stands out for you about the results, and is there anything that has surprised you?
The top three places I'm not tremendously surprised by, or by the order, to be honest. I'm a little surprised that Vanguard did as poorly as she did, but as you said, it's kind of that it's the end results rather than, and perhaps loses some of the detail. But I would have expected Vanguard to perform a little bit better. Maybe definitely fourth, maybe contesting third.
Yeah, she didn't do quite as well as I'd hoped either. And I think, partly in the fight against Bismarck, Bismarck in particular had a few issues, which we'll talk about when we talk about the full results. So I think if those issues with the game had been resolved, she probably would have placed above Bismarck. And there may be a balancing issue with the base stats in the hulls. But it could also be down to luck, because Vanguard was able to really, fight her corner, and she was definitely doing damage to the enemy pretty consistently. So yeah, it might just also be a bit of bad luck.
Yeah. Well, this is why because obviously we're doing simulations by taking a fixed number of battles, etc. And as you say, like bad luck, a few errors in the game, etc. And it could all go pear shaped. Whereas, if we were doing this, if we had infinite time on our hands, you might run 50 to 100 battles, and you might come up with something slightly different.
Yeah, if I could run them in the background and just it outputs a result, I would absolutely do that. But yeah, I think the 3 is not statistically significant, but close enough for the purposes of entertainment. So yeah, I agree. I think she was a little bit lower than I expected. And one of the things that really stood out for me was the Iowa versus Yamato fight, which was the final. They were the top 2. It was the speed that made the difference.
Yes.
Because Iowa was able to keep Yamato far enough away that she couldn't really hurt Iowa properly. Her action just wasn't good enough, and able to chip away pretty effectively with the 16-inch 50 cal guns. And yeah, I think the speed was the big difference between them in that. Which is nice, because we haven't really seen speed be a factor, the factor that it should be in the Battleship League yet. So it was nice to see. It was nice to see that effect coming to the fore. So yeah, I was pleased by that. But yeah, overall, I thought Division 1 was really close, really interesting fight as well, and yeah, not too far off what one would hope for if you were kind of had the real ships, which sadly we don't. What about the overall Battleship League final results, which I'll swap to on the screen just now? So we've got all the results from the divisions put together into a single list. I haven't done anything complicated with it. There are a couple that I wanted to talk about. One was Bismarck, which I alluded to earlier. I have a distinct impression that the way the game handles turtleback armour is slightly off. In that at close range, you cannot score a penetrating hit against turtleback armour. And I said as much in a few of the videos, and I got quite a lot of pushback in the comments. So I'm pretty confident that turtleback does not render you immune to close range gunfire, but you are the expert, so I thought I would ask you to explain how turtleback operates and whether it was as good as people claim, and if having an 18-inch shells being fired into you pretty much point blank, from 5 or fewer kilometers away, was really something that turtleback was going to protect you from.
Yeah, so there's a few things. Turtleback has more of a weakness at longer distance because of the slope, which means that a hit that comes in higher up on the ship's side and either penetrates the upper part of the belt or possibly even goes over the main thickness portion of the belt, will then, when it contacts the deck armor, i.e. the turtleback, that will obviously now be closer to a perpendicular angle than it would be for a fully horizontal deck.
Yeah.
So turtleback layout isn't particularly good at long range, which is one of the reasons that generally it was abandoned in interwar and World War II battleship designs as gun ranges were getting longer and longer. At closer ranges, there is a certain degree of survivability built into the design, because when you've got shells coming in relatively flat, if they then punch through the armor and then will meet the deck, obviously in an all or nothing design where you have the armor deck completely horizontal, either the shell's coming in above or below that deck. If it gets through the armor and comes in below that deck, it can go on and it's breached the citadel, and that's it. Whereas with a turtleback scheme, assuming that the ship is still vaguely horizontal and it hasn't got a significant pitch going on, then it now encounters this very heavily sloped armor after having already passed through the belt. That will, in most circumstances, allow a fairly significant degree of resistance, but it is not absolute for a number of reasons. Apart from anything else, even if a shell doesn't actually fully penetrate the turtleback, the most turtleback designs, including Bismarck, the deck armor itself isn't that thick. So a shell that hits and then explodes, either in the process of skipping off or in the process of partially penetrating or whatever, is still likely to bulge in the inside of that armor deck and cause a bunch of spalling and fragments and splinters. And secondly, there is a physical material limit to what you can actually do with that sloping. So if you're talking about point blank fire from a Yamato's 18.1 inch, even if the mathematics technically says you should be able to resist it, that's not actually how real life physics works.
No. Yeah.
Because one of the examples I like to use is that in theory, if you say took a pencil, which obviously the pencil head can simulate, roughly speaking, a shell, albeit it's usually a bit more pointy than the shell's armor piercing cap, but you get the idea. Maybe the back end of a pencil in that case. And you lay out a sheet of aluminium foil. And let's say that sheet of aluminium foil is a foot long. In theory, if you run your pencil along the table that the foil is on, its mathematical apparent thickness is a foot. And you are never going to push a pencil blunt end first through a foot of aluminium. But what happens in real life is not the pencil stops as soon as it touches the aluminium. What happens is the aluminium foil gets rucked up and torn.
Yeah.
Because
and,
it's only of a certain thickness, and that's an extreme example, but that's basically what a very heavy shell moving an appreciable velocity will eventually do to turtleback armor once the velocities, the weights, and etc. get high enough.
Yeah, and it's one of those, because I used to teach physics, and it's one of those funny things where, you think, oh, but the formulas say this, and it's like, well, those formulas make a lot of assumptions, and unless you're aware of those assumptions, then you're not going to see the full picture. And with the turtleback, it makes complete sense. Even if a shell does bounce off it, the shell's inside the ship and probably going to explode at that point, which creates a lot of damage to the turtleback itself. Or it's just so huge and massive that when it plows into the sloped armor, it doesn't matter that it's sloped, it's going to buckle and bend and break.
I mean, as you know from physics, I think where the issue comes in sometimes with games and with more simplistic analyses is that people look at, here is projectile of mass X and velocity Y coming in at angle Z, and then they calculate the apparent armor thickness based on that angle, and they basically treat it as if that is the vector of the force. And nothing else matters. So you've basically got an infinitely wide plate of this thickness, when in actual fact, as you know, when you have an inclined force against a plane, you then resolve that force into the horizontal force and the vertical force, i.e. perpendicular and parallel, and then you work out, okay, well, this is the total force is acting on it. And that's, I think, where a lot of people sometimes fall down, because the perpendicular force that you resolve, if that force alone is enough to just buckle and shear 3-4 inches of steel, then it's going to do that. It's going to go straight through, regardless of the fact that the apparent, the diagonal apparent thickness might be 8, 9, 10 inches or whatever. Doesn't actually matter at that stage.
No, it makes sense.
And I think the other thing when it comes to Bismarck and turtleback designs generally, which are again a lot of World War II period game simulators tend to, I think, sometimes struggle with, and potentially might also be a thing with Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts, is that there are a number of other weaknesses to the design. There's, and as I've said before when I've talked about Bismarck on my channel, there's sinking a ship, but there's also rendering a ship combat ineffective, and those two can be entirely different. And with a turtleback design, particularly with Bismarck's turtleback design as she was historically built, one of the biggest problems you have with her is that the enclosed volume of the citadel, because the turtleback has to be lower in the ship, is actually less than what you need for reserve buoyancy. So with any other all-or-nothing ship of the period, the citadel, assuming it remains unbreached, has enough buoyancy to keep the ship afloat, even if everything else is riddled and full of water. Whereas on Bismarck, even if you never breached the citadel, if you can flood enough of the rest of the ship, she'll still sink. Because there's not enough buoyancy there, which it's not going to simulate, because the flooding simulation mechanics within Ultimate Admiral Dreadnoughts aren't that advanced.
No, and I think it's worth pointing out that the Bismarck in game, as we built her, is pretty much a perfect, no flaws. If everything was worked, like I was reading that was it the fire control cables were above the armoured deck plates, so they were very easy to damage, which knocked out the fire control pretty early. This is one of the other things. And it's a game. It's simplistic, but
well, again, this is one of the other problems she had in battle, is that you have the main fire control system, which obviously fire control computers way down deep in the ship. And then you have the rangefinders and or radar, if you've got it, positioned high up in the ship, usually on the foremast or some permutation thereof, if it's become a superstructure. And on British and American designs and on a few other designs in order to maintain a certain level of redundancy. The cables were run up, but they were run up with splinter-proof protection. And that meant that, okay, a direct hit will still sever the cables, but anything that's not a direct hit won't.
Yeah.
And so if you, for example, if you're ever aboard an American fast battleship, which obviously by this point I have been, when you're going up what I call the forward pyramid, you'll notice there's this core armoured tube that you basically are circling round and round and round. And as I said, that basically means if you hit the superstructure and the shell explodes, as long as it's not a direct hit on that tube, the fire control cabling will remain intact. With Bismarck and with a few other German ships, they did run a degree of armouring on the cabling lower down in the superstructure, but in the upper part of the superstructure, instead of going for something like the British and Americans, they, if I'm remembering correctly, they actually went for multiple cables, which, okay, if one gets severed, others should be okay, but those cables were not protected in the upper portion of the superstructure. And that meant that if you took a large shell hit in or near the upper superstructure, then the blast wave and the shrapnel and splinters would destroy everything that wasn't protected, which meant it didn't matter if you had 2 cables, 10 cables, or 400 cables, they were all cut.
Yeah.
And that was that.
Yeah. So, yeah, it was just... it was really interesting. But, yeah, I think Bismarck did better than she would have done historically, simply because the game doesn't simulate the kind of flaws that she had as a ship. So it's kind of like a perfected Bismarck coming in fourth, which I think when you look at it like that does kind of make a little bit more sense.
Yeah, it's a little bit, I think, like to a certain degree, almost like in World of Warships, you know, where barring some very, very, very unlucky hits, you can be almost as combat capable at 1 HP as you were at full HP. Yeah. And then it's kind of emphasis on either you're sunk or you're not. And in real life, that's not how it works. But that additional complicating factor is something that is actually very difficult to program into games for a start, which is probably a good chunk of why they don't do it. But I think also, to be honest, the other part of why a lot of games don't do it is because, to be brutally honest, as much as people might say they want a realistic battleship simulator, they really don't. Because if you were to actually have that, outside of maybe 1 or 2 games I can think of that have come out over the years, a battleship combat, unless you get a lucky magazine strike, would be 5, 10, 15 minutes of excitement, followed by whoever's lost having to sit there for another half hour to an hour, either whilst their ship is progressively reduced to smaller and smaller pieces, or whilst they very slowly roll over and sink. And that's not particularly fun. People want to be like, oh, okay, I've lost, I blow up or I sink, that's it, bye-bye.
Makes sense. And I mean, I think Ultimate Admiral does have some degradation of aim and things like that as you take damage, but it's fairly minor, and you can lose turrets and things, but it's not a case of the kind of very critical first proper hit which kind of dominated the thinking behind battleship tactics of the era. But no, that's really interesting. And the other one that I have an asterisk or 2 asterisks next to is not Hood, but King George V.
Yeah.
So, and we talked about it in the Division 2 results as well. I think that she did not do as well as we would hope because of the way the game handles a mixed battery of quadruple guns and a single twin, and some failings in that. And we were thinking perhaps about ways to take another look at her in particular. So we can talk about that in a video where we talk about KG5. But that led us on to thinking about something else, which is paper designs, which got asked about frequently in the comments of several of the videos. Are we going to see, this ship or that ship?
Yeah.
So are there any paper ships that you would like to see, apart from us having a look at some of the alternative designs for the KG5s?
Well, there are a few that we can look at, actually. A lot of it is going to actually be quite helpful because we've got these designs already. We've built the hulls, and even if the updates have wiped them, we've got basically the instruction manual on how to rebuild them. Now, overall, of the ships that we've actually got in our league, there is, of course, the A150 Super Yamato, which would just be Yamato except twin 20-inch guns instead of triple 18s. To try and deal with the KGV problem. I mean, whilst the closest match in terms of number of guns would probably be just to rearm KGV with 3 triples, which would give her 9 guns, which it's the same forward firepower and only 1 less aft.
Did they ever consider that as an option, the 3 triple 14s?
They didn't particularly. I think it may have shown up occasionally in 1 or 2 very sketch designs, but it was generally considered that given that they were building in an environment, even though Second London Treaty said you could only build 14-inch guns, they were building with Nagato and Colorado and their own Nelsons in existence.
Yes.
At which point, having 9 14-inch guns, it was felt would probably be too far down the pecking order of firepower.
Yeah.
So, to get closest, we could do that, or there's the alternative, which kind of the first preference design, I guess, the first one they thought up at the time, which would have been KGV, but with 3 triple 15s of a new design. So better range and armor penetration capability than the historic 15-inch 42. That would be an interesting one to do. And of course, you have original KGV before they cut down the B turret from a quad to a twin, so 3 quads. And whether you do 1, 2, or 3 of the variants, all of them have uniform numbers of guns in their turrets, which will hopefully resolve the game bug issue.
Absolutely. I would very much like to see all 3, to be honest. And the A150 sounds really interesting as well. I know from some of the comments, one of the ones that got mentioned a lot back in the first division was the Scharnhorst, with the 15-inch guns swapped in. Yeah. 3 twin 15s. Yeah, that will be an interesting one to do as well. Again, it's a relatively easy swap out. Another one that could be done, I don't know if it's going to massively affect her place in the standings, but given what we said earlier about Iowa versus Yamato and how the speed came into effect, it might, would be what I call the small tube boiler Queen Elizabeth. Okay.
So that's a little bit of an engineering thing. I've mentioned it on my channel, and Dr. Clark has as well a few times. And it's basically the fact that the Queen Elizabeth, when she was actually constructed, they constructed her with boilers that had what they call large tube boilers. So fewer larger tubes for the generation of steam. At the time, small tube boilers, where you had, as the name suggests, smaller but more numerous tubes and therefore an exponentially larger surface area, were coming in. And the use of small tube boilers later in the 1910s would be a significant step up in power generation, which would allow for things like Hood to be built. But at the time, Admiral Jellicoe wanted the small tube boilers in Queen Elizabeth, but was told by the shipyards that we don't think we can really necessarily do it. We don't particularly like the technology. And in the end, he allowed himself to be won over by that. But he went on record in the immediate post-war era as saying that in hindsight, he thinks he probably should have not done that and stuck to his guns. And if he'd done that, then the estimates were that QEs could have reached about 28 knots, which would have made them full-on 1910s fast battleships. So given that increasing the speed of the GUI in Ultimate Admiral will probably be just putting the slider up. It'd be interesting to see how jumping 3 or 4 knots actually affects her combat capabilities.
Yeah, that would be very interesting.
And likewise, there's a few other fun things you can do. There's the F3 battlecruiser design, which was under consideration instead of O3, which was Nelson. And that's you replace the 16s with 15s, drop an inch or two off the armor, and then her speed also goes up to, I think it's either 28 or 30 knots.
Okay.
That might make a rather interesting ship to play with.
The other British one that got mentioned a lot, and one that I'm interested in as well, is the Lions, which were laid down but never
completed.
Never really got very far. But
now the interesting thing at that point will be to decide which variant of the Lion we're going with.
Indeed. I mean, we can look at the different variants that we consider, because didn't they? I'm not sure they actually did. They finalise it on am I thinking it was a triple guns in 3 turrets, A, B, X.
It was triple 16s. So very much like the American fast battleships. And the armor scheme didn't change hugely. There was a little bit more added to the deck as time went on, between the 1939 version, which was actually laid down, and then the sort of revised 1941, 42, 43 versions, which they kept sketching until they cancelled them. The main changes were things like, do you have aircraft facilities? What kind of radar are you going to be fitted with? What's your anti-aircraft battery going to be? And all of this. And between that and some deck armor upgrades and everything, the tonnage went up as well. So usually, given that we've kind of tried to go with most of these ships for their optimal variant, I think probably you'd want Lion 42 or 43 as the one that we build. But that would definitely, it'd be a newish hull, but considering they are evolutions from King George V, it wouldn't be that difficult to do.
No, definitely an interesting one to look at.
Looking at some of the other nations, at the lower levels, I don't think there's much. There's not really a variant of Congo that's going to be any better. The same with Renown. We've covered Scharnhorst. Andrew Dora is already the refit. Strasbourg, Nagato, Fuso, Issei. Unless we want to go in and try and build a Tosa class battleship or something, but then that would involve building brand new things. Tosa, South Dakota 1920, and N3, the Washington Cherry Tree ships, and the accompanying battle cruisers. That might be a separate thing, maybe a mini Washington Cherry Tree League. Littorio, there's minor variants that would make her Roma, but that's not really going to change much, I don't think. Richelieu, however, would be an interesting one, because with Richelieu, you've got 2 options. You can either go, if we're doing Lion, you could do Alsace, although we'd have to agree on what variant Alsace is going to use, because there are a few of those, and it's literature disagrees onto which one the French actually ended up picking. But there is a slightly easier Richelieu variant to play with, which is Gascogne, which is basically Richelieu, except instead of having 2 quads forward, she has 1 quad forward, 1 quad aft, and completely rearranges the ship's layout as a result.
Interesting. But that would definitely be an interesting one to look at.
So I think broadly speaking, and I guess audience can vote what they'd like to see us try first. I think there's 3 general lines that you could go down. There's the lines of what possible alternate variants of the ships that are in the league could we go with? Then there's the Washington Cherry Tree sextuplet, the battleships and battlecruisers that were cancelled by the 1922 Washington Treaty. And then there's the follow-on stuff. So that would be A150, Alsace, Lion, maybe H39 for the Germans, that kind of thing.
Montana as well would be
Yes.
one to look at.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting. Well, I think that definitely the Washington lot would maybe warrant their own sort of mini series. Yeah, I think having a look at some of the variants of the ships that were in the league, and then we could maybe do some of the paper ships. But yeah, let us know down in the comments what do you want to see? What weird and wonderful designs from the sketchbooks of naval designers across the world do you want to see us attempt to recreate? And yeah, we'll find them some suitable opponents and see how they fare.
Sounds good.
Oh, fantastic! Well, thank you very much for joining me today, and thank you very much for all your help with the Battleship League. And hopefully, we'll see you on the channel again soon, building some interesting what if ships. Slightly less historical, but still interesting, no doubt. And yeah, thank you so much for all your help, and we'll see you again soon.
See you soon. Bye.